All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody who is already online, and I know we had some folks show up early, and for folks who made time to come out here tonight live here in Berkeley to join us. Today, what we're going to be doing is primarily going into what are some of the tools that you can use to address microaggressions, and especially thinking about this in terms of teams and in the workplace. But before we get into the tools, I want to do a quick little review of our last learning opportunity. So this is part 2 of a series of 3. The previous one was on unconscious bias. I know some of you participated in that. So we'll do a quick little snapshot of that, a quick little snapshot of what you learned online about microaggressions, and then I'll start to respond to some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. But at any point, you can submit questions on the live stream or in person. We ask that you use the mic so that the folks on the live stream can also hear your participation. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. I'm Elida Bautista. I'm the Director of Inclusion and Diversity. If you watched the videos ahead of time, which were essentially where the content was, you learned a little bit more about me. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is a little bit of community agreements for norm setting. I know sometimes the conversation might feel a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure if I can say this. So we just try to create some norms and agreements ahead of time so that folks feel comfortable jumping in with questions or comments. And so I'll just go through these really quickly. The first is that we're asking you to stretch, right? So just try, we might practice some tools that we're asking you to try on. And the concept here is to stretch yourself so that you're growing, right? And that creates a little discomfort, but not so much to the point where you start to shut down and pull away and not want to participate. So just monitor where you're at and what is that area of growth for you, that stretch zone. Speaking your own truth just says that as you, comments or questions that you might have, rather than trying to guess what somebody else meant or their experience, just speak from your own experience. Understanding the difference between an intent and impact will be something that we'll be talking about a little bit more in depth today because it was part of the content and also it came up in some of the questions. But essentially what we're asking to do here is to try to acknowledge and understand and be open to feedback about how something lands, regardless of how you intended it. Practice both and is essentially about not negating somebody's experience by saying no but or that's not what it's the both and, right? There's room for both to be true. Refraining from blaming or shaming. We're all here to learn. We're all likely to make a stumble at some point, whether it's tonight here or somewhere else in our personal or professional lives. So just really extending that grace for others and really creating room for learning by not shaming. Step up, step back, just as, monitor how much you might be raising your hand or talking and making sure that we have room for everybody's voices in the room. Practicing mindful listening is about not wanting to jump in and cut somebody off, but rather really just taking in what they're sharing, especially when we're doing any kind of group activities. Confidentiality. We're here to take home learnings. If you learned something personal about somebody else in the course of today's session or any of our sessions, please ask for permission to do any kind of follow-up or to share. But mostly we want you to focus on what is the lesson learned. And then, again, staying engaged. So don't check out physically, emotionally, mentally, to whatever extent, whatever it takes. If you are getting tired and you need to stand around and fidget, that's totally okay as long as you're staying present and engaged. All right? Any questions about these or anything that needs to be added? Any folks online? All right. So one of the first things that we want to do is just get folks in the room, knowing who else is in the room. So for our folks online, this is an opportunity to add to the comments and the live stream. You can add basically, we want you to respond to these questions on the stream, so that folks know who they're participating in the session with. Here, for those folks that are here at Berkeley, I'm going to ask you to turn to your closest neighbor and just share a couple of the quick things. One is your name. What is your affiliation to Haas, current industry? What's an activity that you use to de-stress? You'll find that in all of these sessions, one of the things that I talk about a lot is our capacity to self-regulate and have that awareness of our own, like, where are we emotionally? So the more that we're kind of naming that and thinking about what do I use, and any, shared practices, but also it's kind of fun to see, like, oh yeah, I've tried that once, or whatever it might be. And then, given the season, we thought a fun one to share is, like, what is that home remedy, your go-to cold remedy that you swear by or that was used in your family growing up? So, little parent share time.
It's actually rubbing tiger balm.
It's very good. Oh, wow. Wow.
Sophisticated for showing us.
What's that? Oh, we got some?
Yeah. Someone said hi and then retracted their comment.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. It's like a delayed. In case I cuss.
Yeah, I'll share M. Gabriel, Michelle.
Yeah. De-stressing by cat videos? Oh, I love it. After a hot shower. Oh, that's Kevin's. You just pair share time, even though you already know each other. Or maybe you should pair with the woman that's behind you. What's her name again? All right, we're going to have you two pair and share so you can learn something new about a participant. So now.
I'll share with
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. I'm like, you're monitoring them anyway. Let them actually participate. All right, we'll take a couple more seconds and then we'll come back to.
I'll be honest, level set. Cold remedy, fix on my
And I find that preparing and cooking the food, it doesn't take too long. It's distracting if I play music. It's distressing.
Don't try to push through it. Go home and get in bed and go to sleep. I try to do. It's not always possible.
So I should turn it off whenever I'm not speaking. All right. So I overheard and picked up on some fun ones. So there was de-stressing with cat videos, playing music was another one that I picked up on, and then we had a couple of fun cold remedies. The tiger balm after a hot shower, it was one that spoke to me. I'll say mine growing up was my mom would roast tomatoes on the comal, on the oven or stove or whatever, and then tie it to the bottom of our feet and on our chest, like when we had a particular chest cold, Chicago winters. And it worked. It would stop all that coughing. So feel free to look it up. It feels torturous in the moment, but it works. So we're just going to do a really quick review, just to do a little level setting from the previous session and from what you learned online for this session. Like I mentioned previously, we talked about unconscious bias. That was our first lifelong learning digital session 1. I recommend that's all available for you if you want to go back and participate in that one and view the pre-work as well as the online session. That's available as well, right, Sarah? Yeah. But essentially, when we were, the couple highlights in terms of unconscious bias and how that relates to what we're talking about today is, one of the things that we went through in the pre-work was around social identities and privilege, right? And what we learned in the unconscious bias session was that all of us have bias, and they tend to favor those with privileged identities, right? Or privileged identities, I should say. And then the other piece was that certain scenarios can activate unconscious stereotypes and attitudes. So being tired, multitasking, and being in a hurry, right? Which is why a lot of what I kind of talk about and try to integrate is this need for self-regulation and self-awareness around what is it that we need to show up more present and available, right? To essentially not rely on those mechanisms of all sorts of biases. All of our cognitive errors essentially are more vulnerable when we're tired, multitasking, or in a hurry. So the other thing that we covered in the last session were all the different ways that you can address unconscious bias. And I'm bringing these back in today because I think these are good for you to have in mind if you participated last time, that these are ways that will also play into your ability to address microaggressions, to recognize them, but also to interrupt them. And over time, build these habits that will help you in noticing them and addressing them. Ooh. So we're about to get into the topic of microaggressions and some of the questions that were sent in. But like I mentioned, one of the things that helps us is always, to whatever extent we can kind of be present and slowing down. So we had a little bit of fun exchange, but I also want to bring into the room a little bit of centering in whatever way you do that for yourself. We talked about de-stressing, but I'm just going to do a quick one, which is grounding. And so I'm just going to demonstrate. I hope this is okay for those online. Please follow along and participate wherever you might be doing this. So just planting your feet on the ground. You can put your hands on your lap or wherever you feel comfortable. And we're just going to take a deep breath in slowly through our nose. And exhaling slowly through our mouth. I want you to keep breathing slowly in through your nose and out through your mouth. And as you breathe in, just kind of do a little scan for your body, how you're feeling right now, where you might feel some tension in your body. And I want you to pay attention to how it feels to have your feet on the ground. Just the texture, the weight, just the stability. And on your next inhale and exhale, I want you to pay attention to how it feels to be seated in the seat that you're in. The support, any cushioning. Maybe it's soft, maybe it's a hard surface. And if you have your hands on your lap or on a chair, on a table, just notice the texture, how it feels against your hands, whether it's a surface or a textile. And do one more deep breath in. And exhale slowly. And as you take a breath in, just again notice how you're feeling in your body. And when you exhale next, you're just going to come back to the room, open your eyes, shake it out. That was obviously very brief for a grounding exercise, but it's just grounding technically is the opportunity to kind of come to the present moment. You might have just gotten off work, or depending on the time zone that you're tuning in, might be still in the middle of your day, or all sorts of things going on. And it's so easy to have our mind in multiple places, right? So tuning into our body and the physicality of where we're at and grounds us to this space. So this is also from the pre-work. This was the concept of microaggressions. So we already went over this, but essentially we're talking about everyday kinds of snubs, right? The idea of microaggressions initially was posed by a psychologist back in the 60s, right? And often when we're talking about, inequalities, whether we're talking about racism or other isms, often people think, well, we have these extreme examples in our history, right? And that's often people think, well, that's not what's happening now. Therefore, this isn't the same thing, right? Like if, like one that gets used is like, well, if we're talking about racism, that shows up in this particular way in the U.S., for example, with the KKK, right? So anything short of that is not racism, right? And this is speaking to what are other ways that this manifests that has an impact over time when you're communicating derogatory ways or excluding people actively, either through these messages or through the behavior in a way that has over time this cumulative stress impact that you might also experience from direct racism and that manifests in other ways, right? So essentially, that's what we're getting at with the concept. And I want to just jump into some of the questions that were asked ahead of time, and if there are any that are coming up now for you in the platform, feel free to type them out as I start to cover these. So I'll start to cover these, and then we'll see what comes up for you, those of you that are in the room and those of folks that are logged on, okay? So one of the ones that came in was that most of us have a mix of privileged or unprivileged identities, right? And so in the module on social identities and privilege, I went through some of those areas where I have particular advantages and where I might be a member of a targeted group and where it might be somewhere in between, right, like age or these other ways that I identify. So the question that came in was, can we use these to connect meaningfully to others as a bridge rather than using these identities potentially to other, that, I think one of the things that often comes up in diversity and inclusion work is the idea that if we talk about it, we're highlighting differences, and that's creating distance, and maybe that's the wrong thing to do, rather than, can we all just get along and see that there are connections, right? How many folks have had thoughts like this or heard comments like this in the past of like, why are we talking about differences or privilege instead of talking about the ways that we're all similar or where we might connect on our ways that we're marginalized or things like that? Anybody have those kind of, yeah. And so typically when I start a session, I start with something like what we did today, which is, a way of connecting. And if you recall back to our unconscious bias session, one of the things that we talked about was how getting to know individuals and more individuals from any particular group then allows you to have a variety of examples of ways of being that then breaks down your ability to stereotype somebody from a group, right? So if not just me as a Chicana, but if 50 Chicanas, then you might find that we all listen to different music. There might be some overlap here and there, but there's a variety of food that we might eat, or ways we dress, or regions that we're from in the country, experiences that we've had growing up or travel, right? So like the more examples you have from any group makes it a lot harder to say, oh, all people are from this identity are of the singular way of being, right? And so that's where this opportunity to get to know people and to connect, right? And what is also true is that, I think about this like in a normal curve, right? So in any population, you're going to have, regardless of what the thing is, right, you're going to end up, if you get a sample, right, you're going to have data points from all these, right? And so if you think of each group being people that have a lot of different experiences within this group, and then there's this other group, right? And then there's this other group. And so essentially that there's more overlap in experiences and opportunity and ways to connect than there are differences. Right. So I think, yes, the answer is yes. We can certainly take advantage to bridge opportunities and to try to then use that as also a way to essentially give benefit of the doubt and to not discriminate, right, or not mistreat people. I will also say, though, that I think it's important to not use that as a way of not seeing what somebody's experience might be, right, that sometimes there was a period of our history in the U.S. in particular where the approach was to not talk about race, for example, and we're all just going to be colorblind. And we just all shared cold remedies, right? So what might be true is that we might have each had a different cold remedy, right? But what was also true is we all had a cold remedy, right? Like we all experience colds. We all have something, whether we got it from our family, whether we got it from over the counter, or we made it up ourselves, or we found it on Google, or whatever that is, right? But the reality is, like, there's connection and there's also difference that can be celebrated, that there's still an entry point, an opportunity that isn't about, well, my cold remedy is better than yours or whatever, but it's rather that, so essentially what I'm trying to say is that the colorblind piece doesn't work either, right? That what's also true is recognizing that while there might be points of connection and overlap, that I move through the world and am perceived differently than maybe some of you are because of those social identity characteristics, right? So there's capacity for empathy, capacity for overlap in experience and connection. Like we're both from Chicago, right? Hey, right? But also that there are other parts of us that are valid and that are important to our experience, that inform how we move through the world and things that we have to navigate because of it, right? I don't know what it's like to have to navigate this campus even if I were in a wheelchair, right? How do I get to this particular classroom? How long is that going to take to get from the Haas gate to here, right? So pretending that that's not a part of that person's experience doesn't help. That doesn't mean that I can't connect with them on a bunch of other things like, hey, there's a Haas connection, right? This person is clearly smart. If they went to Haas, they are probably doing something really interesting. All those things are also true, right? So it's a both and. Does that help clarify? Are there any questions coming in from? Oh, we got some more online home remedies, which were Egyptian licorice tea. That's a fun one. But it doesn't look like we have any additional comments or questions. So one clarification on the online piece was clarifying what is it about confusing somebody's name that makes it a microaggression? What is the implication behind that, right? So if two people from one identity group are getting mixed up, whether that's in a team at work or in a social setting, whatever it might be. And does anybody here have some thoughts about what that might be implying or why that would be a microaggression? Can you use the mic?
Hi. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is Orion. I think that can be kind of like treating people as fungible. Like, well, I can just trade Jesus for Jose because it's the same to me, right? And maybe that wasn't your intent, but it's the, what do you say, the effect or the impact.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so this person wasn't important enough for me to encode that they're this individual. I'm grouping them with the same as this other person who happens to have their ethnicity, right? Even though Jesus works in finance and Jose works in operations or whatever, right? Like they're, and there's a lot of examples of this in the literature where the name switching in particular, when there are only two in a company or in a team, is something that happens pretty frequently. I think the other implication of this, is there anybody else that wants to add anything in terms of an implication for the workplace? Can you use your mic? I'm sorry. The mics are right in front of you. Yeah.
I was just going to say this happens to me all the time at work. There's one other South Asian girl, and we get confused all the time, and they ask us for each other's work. It just seems like they're not paying enough attention to actually pinpoint which one of us is which one, and actually identify each one as our own person.
Yeah. And so the implication that I'm thinking of in that situation is, how do you have faith in the system then that you are being credited or valued for your contributions, right? When it comes to a performance review, when it comes to opportunities for being on some new exciting project or a promotion, right? And so the implications of not taking the time to get to know the person in some ways is saying, on the surface level, I can't distinguish you, right? And then in a deeper level, that has a lot of ripple effects then of in terms of respect and in terms of somebody feeling like this is a place where I'm going to thrive, right? If you can't even learn my name. Does that help? Any other thoughts or comments about that? All right. There's one more clarification question, which is one of the examples that is used in the toolkit that was part of the pre-work was, essentially, and often I get this question as well, which is why is this a bad thing if you ask somebody where they're from, right? And I think the follow-up questions actually answer the first question, which is what are other ways you can ask that if you're curious, right? And I think there's two things going on here. One is we are in a setting, whether it's at Haas or in any particular organization, where folks who come through business school by nature are social, sociable, curious, interested in others, right? And so they genuinely want to connect. And so there's how do we talk about this and express that curiosity if I'm potentially offending somebody? The other piece that's happening simultaneously is that the US, Canada, Latin America are all countries that have had a mix of immigration from all over the world, right? And so in California, for example, this used to be a part of Mexico, right? And so you have people who present as indigenous or as of Spanish background that were already here. You have, Chinese labor that was, brought in to build railroads, et cetera. We have, long history of Japanese immigration, actually going back, it was farm work originally. And and I could go on and on, right? But so the reality is that in the US, if you're asking somebody, where are you from, but you're only asking people who are not white presenting, right? Who are not of some European, potentially, descent, then there's the assumption is you must not be from here, right? You don't belong here. You look different from me, and I'm not the one that is not from here, so it must be you, essentially. So, if you're fourth generation and you get this question on a daily basis or weekly basis, there's this constant reminder of I see you as somebody who can't possibly be from this place, right? I get this question all the time, of course, because I am brown, and it presents in a variety of ways, which is, where are you from? I say I'm from Chicago, and they're like, no, really, but where are you from? And I'm like, really? I'm from Chicago, but we moved to California when I was a teenager, and then it's like, and then I realize what they're getting at, because when I flip it and I say, well, where are you from? There's this discomfort. There's like, well, I'm American, and it's like, well, so am I. I just told you I'm from Chicago, but that wasn't good enough, right? And I often get, when I travel, you don't look American. And I always say, well, Americans look like me before they look like anybody else, actually. So there's that. But that's what's behind it, right? And that if we really examine our history in California and in the U.S., the other piece of this in terms of that that kind of tax the psychological safety piece is that we actually do have a history of, deporting citizens. Like, we have done that in terms of Mexican citizens from California, and even now there's actually a practice that where U.S. citizens of Mexican descent are having their passports revoked and being told, well, we're not really sure this is authentic. And so, honestly, it's to that level of like, I'm not sure I should travel abroad because I don't think they're going to let me back in. And for a little while, I was joking about it, but I kind of sense that this might be coming only because I'm aware of our history and how many times this has happened in the past. We have a history of interning Japanese that were American citizens, right? So when you ask somebody, where are you from, and that the underlying message is you're not really American, there's also this like kind of a physical safety thing that it triggers for those who know my group hasn't always been welcomed here, right? There's a little bit, even if your intention isn't to threaten, what it's triggering for somebody who hasn't always felt safe is, am I safe here, right? That's the antenna that goes up. Does that help? Any comments or questions online on that one? Okay. I know we're working on a little bit of a 10-second delay or something, so it might be that comments or questions come in. And then, let's see. This one also, is anyone from a privileged group by definition an oppressor or oppressing targeted social groups? And then I think that, again, the second piece almost answers the first one, is the assumption that the power dynamics and a social inequity, like when there are folks of different privilege status, are they automatically oppressing somebody if they're not aware, right? And unless they're using that membership and awareness to address it, are they automatically then oppressing it, is the question. Does anybody have some thoughts on this? I know it's a heavy question.
So I don't think it's automatic, but I do think that there's need for increased awareness. So I find myself in situations where I'm aware that when it comes to power dynamics of people I'm managing, right? So even though, like, let's say I'm a minority, I might be managing someone who identifies as Caucasian, but I have control over how their workday progresses or assignments I'm giving them. Or sometimes I might even say, I may not understand that they, as somebody just fresh out of college, have trouble making rent, and I might say something casually about, just you should take time on Saturdays to go to an expensive dinner or whatever, and then I immediately realize that I have a position of privilege where that's no big deal for me, but it might not be the case for somebody else. So it's not always necessarily just social. It could be just any form of privilege that you have that others don't have.
Yeah. So. Well, but if we take that a little bit further, the example you gave about a restaurant, if there was some expectation for your team to go to a team dinner that wasn't being paid for the workplace, and you have somebody that's just out of college is still paying and starting to pay their loans and might not be in the same kind of financial situation, and you're picking this restaurant that to you is affordable and not a big deal, potentially you're setting up a dynamic that's based on a class privilege, right? Where somebody feels obligated to participate because, otherwise the team is going to see them as not being somebody who's interested or engaged, and now has to make some kind of financial sacrifice to be able to show up to this dinner, right? And we can put in a lot of other kind of demographic variables, right? A parent, somebody potentially, we use ability in access, could be having to think about that, right? Dietary restrictions, right? Or we think about how often these kinds of things happen around alcohol, right? Like, and then you have religious or other, folks who are sober, and so there's all these ways where if we're not aware of our privileged identities, but we're in a position of power to create a condition that impacts how others feel at work, right, can get in the way. Other thoughts about, is it automatically, when you have these kind of social inequities, is it automatically that you are oppressing somebody who is at a different status, or are there ways that you can mitigate that?
Age.
age is like, I feel like everyone oppresses with age. Like, if you see someone who's younger than you, you automatically think that they're not as smart or not as wise or don't know anything about what you know. So I think that age is a huge oppressor for social groups.
Can you say anything about that in where somebody could have an age difference and not actively oppress somebody else?
Well, I feel like in my group, I don't necessarily age oppress because I work with students and I also work with like foster kids and stuff like that. And usually I always feel like everybody should have an opinion or a say-so, or they may have like better ideas than me. So I always try to just like ask them what they think and like, you know, ask and wait and try to listen to them before I start going or see what they know first.
Yeah.
Is usually a good way to do it. And I feel like then they feel more comfortable about it or feel that they're more valued.
Right.
And that their opinions are valuable.
Exactly. So what you're describing is how you build psychological safety in a team, essentially, right? That you actually are interested in somebody's input, you take the time to listen, you actually hold the possibility of they might have better ideas than me, even if I'm in charge, right? And so that's where it doesn't have to be automatic if you're aware of it, right? Where you might get into trouble is if you're not aware, right? That you hold a privilege, right? I think a lot of us might come into this work and the pre-work, and I would be curious what your experience was, with some discomfort with owning that we have privileges, right? Sometimes just that word automatically is like, well, that's not me. I didn't grow up rich, or I didn't grow up XYZ, right? People feel a lot of discomfort around that term, or the idea that that might be true, right? And it's like, oh, well, not me. I work at Berkeley or whatever it might be, right? And so there's the opportunity to have that awareness of where, relative to other people, might I have some advantages, but also how do I not lean into the advantages, but instead use that awareness to create an atmosphere that allows others to engage and feel valued. Age and body type are actually the two top discrimination categories where, in terms of complaints filed at the state level in California. I don't know what's true for other states or other countries, but here it's age and body type or size. And so, but it's not one that gets talked about a lot, so I'm glad you highlighted it. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this one? Let me just check my notes real quick. I'm recovering from illness, and I have to admit I'm not at the top of my game today. So let me just double check what else I wanted to share about this. I think I got it. Yeah, so essentially, that when we're not aware of the privilege, we're more likely to cause harm. But I think that there's also opportunity when you're aware of your privilege and your status to actually act as an ally or create a welcoming environment so that it's not this automatic, right? But that, it's just, it's a dynamic that will, if we're not catching it and we're not owning our privilege in that interaction, then we're potentially shutting down some of that conversation. We're potentially disengaging our team members or employees, right? Any thoughts on that? I know you have a lot of experience with this work, so.
I mean, my understanding as I've come to this work was just that it's uncomfortable to own that I might be oppressing someone, even unintentionally, but the very virtue of my unafforded privilege might be preventing somebody else from actualizing their needs. And so I think of it as, and this is not my idea, but I've come to understand that if I'm not working to level the playing field for everybody, then by virtue I am actually oppressing somebody else.
Yeah, well put, thank you. Did you have your hand up?
So I found that for a lot of people, when you even just point out that they have privilege, they automatically go that extra step of, you're calling me an oppressor. So how would you recommend going around that and like bringing the conversation back to, that's not what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just trying to. point out something.
All right, I'll get into the tools of how do we engage in this conversation, but just off the top of my head, one of the things that I would say is I usually try to come in with modeling, right? So owning that I have some areas that I might not have as much awareness because I don't have lived experience or I have more privileges or advantages, right? Like being a U.S. citizen, I've never had to worry about getting a work visa or thinking about how to navigate sponsorship and all those things that are really anxiety provoking and bureaucratic and all of that, right? I have to worry about other things when I apply for jobs, but I don't have to worry about that, right? And so just modeling the owning part to be a stepping stone toward that curiosity, but also then allows the other person potentially to reflect on, I never thought about that, right? I had somebody recently try to kind of join with me in saying they observed something in a group dynamic where where there were several people kind of making references to Native American culture, and she was just like, aren't you offended that they're appropriating? And I was like, well, I don't know these folks, so I can't, from just seeing them, assume what their tribal affiliation is, so I don't feel comfortable calling people out in this situation. And she was just like, I didn't even consider that I was making assumptions about, their identity, and wow. And, and she was somebody who very much was like, I know this stuff, right? And so it was an opportunity for her to step back and come back to me later and say, like, thank you for pointing that out. It hadn't occurred to me that I was making an assumption about several people, and I was angry about the assumption I was making, right? All right, well, since you asked, let's get into some of the tools. Instead of making this an individual reflection, I'll invite folks online to comment on and reflecting on these questions, but also in the room. If you can just kind of name out, don't forget to use your mic. If you think about a time that you have unintentionally offended somebody, what were those signals that helped you to realize, like, oops, I stepped in it? What happened? What did you see maybe in their facial expressions or in their, verbal, or how they interacted with you after that? Anybody have anything that comes to mind?
So I have a recent, on the age one that she was talking about. I was talking with a colleague, and who I think of as a peer, and it just came up, her age, and I was like, oh my goodness, you're my daughter's age. I could be your mother. And I didn't think anything about it. And later she came to me and said, I just want you to know that made me feel really uncomfortable. I want you to think of me as your peer and not your daughter. And I said, I apologized, but I had no idea I had offended her. I had no idea. I thought, that's a great thing. You're young and you're...
Yeah. In the moment, did she have any verbal expression, or did you notice like she just shifted or kind of distanced herself from you? Or...
She probably did, and I didn't notice.
Yeah.
I was so unaware.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm so glad she came back and said that.
Absolutely. One of the things that I usually tell folks is, like, if somebody bothers to give you feedback, it's because they are actually invested in the relationship, right? They care about you enough to circle back and say, you know what, this didn't work for me, right? There are so many other ways that scenario can play out. They can quit, they can just, oh, there she goes, I'm going in the opposite direction, stop engaging, right? In your personal or professional life, there's all these ways that can manifest. So if somebody actually takes the time to circle back and say, here's why that didn't work for me, I think it's a real gift and an opportunity for our own growth and learning, right? And so I'll just leave it at that. Anybody else have kind of, what is their signal or ways that you've responded when somebody's given you feedback?
Well, I would say I have more experience than an employee that works for me, and I actually trained her from knowing nothing in my business to, after 4 years, she knows a fair amount. But I often will make an assumption that she hasn't made a good decision because she doesn't have enough background to make the decision, rather than realizing that she has a different way of thinking. Her decision might be a very good decision. And I always see it because she reacts immediately, and bristles, and I notice it.
Yeah.
And voices get raised. And I have trouble backing down and saying, oh, I still have trouble backing down and saying, maybe your way is a fine way and you should go with it. And not, mine isn't the only way.
Yeah.
But I have trouble with that.
Yeah. So it sounds like in that situation, there is a clear, obvious signal, which is the voices get raised, right?
And the facial expression
and the
as
facial
well.
expressions, right? And there might be some whole other dynamic that's happening. Folks have mentioned age or, maybe seniority, all these other things where she might think it's about something else, right? Where in your mind it's a lack of experience. Yeah. All right. So I just wanted to give you sometimes I wanted to start with what happens when somebody gives us feedback, right? When we're the ones that step in it, how do we respond in a way that will be more effective in inviting that feedback, in continuing to create that psychological safety that says, I'm open to your ideas, I'm open to your feedback, even and especially when I might not be going about it the right way, or I might be making some assumptions, right? So the first one is, just kind of having a place to practice, right? So I know we have a lot of participants that are online and not as many in the room. Given that this is a briefer meeting, we won't have time today to practice, but just take some time to come up with what feels natural to you in terms of verbiage, maybe practicing with somebody that you care about or that you feel comfortable and safe with. Maybe you take a team meeting to practice, like, how do you respond when you get challenging feedback? What is the words, and just kind of taking time to get comfortable with that and to get used to being able to say, like, so that you have a go-to rather than being caught off guard and being like, no, not me. That's the response I usually see is, no, that's not how I meant it, right? And that says to me, I don't want to hear this feedback. You're accusing me of something. I'm getting defensive. And so I might not be willing to give feedback the next time and just be like, I'm not sure that person can hear it, right? So just take some time to think about what comes natural to you to be able to say, and what do you need to convey in the moment? Is it, I need some time. I would love to have this conversation, and I'm caught off guard right now, and can I take some time to process your feedback and so that we can have a meaningful conversation about this? Or, if you're noticing some facial expressions coming up or voices being raised, just being able to name that, right? Like, I'm noticing that you're suddenly frowning and that, your voice got really small. Like, something just happened and I'm not sure what it was. Do you mind letting me know what I just said, or, what happened right now in this interaction? Notice your own nonverbal. So I mentioned this one because I've seen it a lot, right? For some people, it's like the, So depending on what is your go-to reaction, just having awareness of that, of what you're conveying in terms of your openness to feedback. Practicing self-regulation. We've practiced some in other sessions as well. Just do whatever it is that works for you, whether that's like singing in the shower or breathing, so that wherever you are in these more difficult situations, you have a little bit more of that self-awareness of your physiology and what it takes to calm it down. And last but not least, I think it's so important to practice a compassion toward ourselves. Like, we all step in it. We all make mistakes. It's also, what is also true is that terms and identities and all of this are ever evolving, right? Nothing is static. And so I think it's important to be open to feedback and to understand why somebody might want to be referred to in a certain way in terms of their identity or what might be true for them. But it's okay to just take that as oh, okay, this is what works for you. I will use that for you, right? Rather than beating ourselves up about oh, I screwed up. I've been trying so hard to, be this more equity fluent leader or whatnot, right? Does that help or make sense? Okay. I think the other piece that I wanted to share was just how not to just say, I'm sorry, or I didn't mean it. That's not what I meant, I'll share an example. I have had friends that were and roommates that were gay or lesbian or trans from a very young age. But more recently, I have several friends that identify as non-binary, right, and that use they, theirs as their pronouns. And so this is a community I care about. This is a community that I've spent a lot of time advocating in my personal life, and I find that, you know, there are times, and so for some of these friends, I formerly knew them as she, and they identify as they. And so maybe 70 to 80% of the time, I get the pronoun right, and then every once in a while, I slip and I revert to she, and then I'm just like, oh, I did that thing, and I feel terrible. And they're forgiving, we're friends, they know me, blah, blah, blah. And still, I'm just like, oh, I'm still working on it, right? I imagine for them, this is an everyday battle across multiple people that they encounter, and they want to just, you know, not have to explain themselves to somebody that they've known for a long time, right? So how do I not just say, I'm sorry, right? It's being able to say, here's what I'm going to try to do so that this doesn't happen again, right? I'm sorry I call Jesus Jose. I'm going to really work on remembering that your name is Jose, right? So taking responsibility, acknowledging the harm, but really sharing what it is that you're committing to doing differently, rather than just being like, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Like, that doesn't really go far if then, you know, you do it again a week later and you just say you're sorry again, right? So what is it that you're committing to doing? And like I said earlier, you know, keeping, like, the acknowledging that they took the time to give you feedback says, I'm interested in staying engaged with you and connected to you, and this is why I'm taking the time to give you this feedback. So to whatever extent you can express appreciation, I know sometimes it's hard in the moment to realize that getting feedback is actually a positive thing, and it's for your own growth and for maintaining that relationship. But if you can practice that, build that into what your go-to saying is. Okay, I'm gonna, given the time, I'm gonna skip the practice piece today because I also want to move into how can you be an effective ally, and a lot of questions that came up were, well, what do I do with this privilege, and what happens if I see or recognize a microaggression? But you can certainly take a snapshot of this. What we're talking about is just, you know, taking time at some point in your own personal time to practice these things, and what are the elements of that that'll work for you, both in terms of realizing, like, how do I not overlook it next time? Like, what do I need to be attuned to? What should I be looking out for? But also, how does that then show up in my own body when I am being given feedback? All right, so some of the questions that came in were, as a mostly privileged person, how can I be a better ally? Or now that I know what privileges I have, what do I do with them, right? Do folks have ideas about what you can do with your privileges based on anything, either based on the pre-work or based on your own personal life or where you've leaned into this?
So I come from relatively lower socioeconomic means. Through education, I've been able to get to a much better position. So now I can recognize the pathway that it took me to get there and try and create shortcuts or provide mentorship to people that are coming from those means to get to a higher point of privilege faster. So being an ally for them in that capacity.
Thank you. Yeah. So leaning into where you have privilege and knowledge base to share out for others to have that opportunity. Yes, please. Use your mic.
Maybe when I recognize that the other person may not be as privileged, just maybe mentioning it explicitly, that I know I am this way, so I'm not coming from that perspective, I'm just coming to help you. And
So potentially just naming it, so not naming where they might be marginalized, but rather naming where you might have some privilege and therefore not have the same level of knowledge or awareness or experience, right? Like, going back to your example, is like just being able to say, like, oh, I'm realizing that I might have a different level of means, so rather than me picking a restaurant, why don't we, you know, collectively vote on a restaurant or something like that. So if I think it takes some time to recognize those nuances of what is offensive, especially if you don't have a certain lived identity or experience. But hopefully that toolkit will help you have some underlying understanding of why certain things are categorized as microaggressions. And we went into a couple of them here, right? Like the name one. So if you are in a workplace and you notice that one of your colleagues is calling Jesus Jose, how might you respond in that moment to be an ally or to essentially lean into your privilege to support Jose when he's being called Jesus? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can be that person to actually, so that Jose doesn't have to say anything and probably won't say anything, I'm guessing, so that you can be that person that goes to that person in private and says, hey, that's actually really degrading, so let's both work on it. I'm working on it too, kind of put myself in that position.
What if this person is both of your supervisors, right? Like, what if that person is the CEO? Would you feel equally comfortable kind of privately going to them and saying, actually, Jose, no? It would be more challenging. Yeah. So there's the status piece of like, what will it take for me to feel safe to bring attention to it? How can I be an effective ally while recognizing in that scenario, depending, you might not have as much privilege, right? Another opportunity might be if it's the CEO or a manager and you're kind of in a parallel position to Jose, you might just like reiterate Jose's name in front of the CEO after they have called him Jesus, right? And be like, Jose, building on that idea, right? So that might be a kind of more a gentle way to bring the name back in to the conversation if it feels too threatening to say, if there's a colleague that has done that, then you can, in private, so that it's not shaming, approach them and say, hey, I noticed you did that a couple times now this week, and you slipped up and called Jose Jesus. Like, I'm not sure if you've noticed that you've been doing that, but I imagine that he's noticed it, right? And so then it doesn't have to be like, you're oppressing, right? And you can own, like, I'm working on it too. I know, Jesus has been here for a long time and we all know him, so we might, have this tendency to, the name's already, at the top of my tongue or whatever. But so there's ways to approach it that don't shut down that person or not have them do this, right? That invites them into the conversation, but actually gets them to think about, how am I going to do this differently, right? That they might go and actually approach Jose then and say, like, eeks, I realized I've been calling you Jesus. I'm so sorry. Like, I'm going to work on practicing calling you by your name and knowing what your function is, right? And giving you the work assignments that belong to you, right? Did you have a thought? You seem to be going for the mic, so.
Well, it was kind of an earlier thought of your answering your question about how to be an ally, how to be positive. So I live in West Oakland, and sometimes I'm not the most courteous driver. That's besides the point. But the result of it is that I realize I don't want to go around being an impolite driver and look like an oppressor. Look like a guy who doesn't care about, the person that's observing, who's there. And so I think I find a real opportunity. I mean, I feel a lot of frustration in the air sometimes, and I've, rather than just ignoring it, I've learned to try to bring something positive to it, and a positive interaction, instead of a non-interaction or avoiding instead of looking at the ground, making sure you're looking at the person you're talking to.
Yeah.
And
if I can ask or explore, is part of that tension around the shifting demographics in West Oakland for those who might be attuned in line and not be aware as much of what's happening in the Bay Area? Is that?
I think so. I've been trying to figure it out. Yeah. I mean, I've had my race named for me on the street.
You've had
my race named for me on the street.
Yeah.
I observe the way I've been actually studying this, and it might make an interesting study. I haven't drawn conclusions yet, but I think the way I see people of different levels of privilege cross the street is very different. I see some people, they've learned to hesitate a lot, and I just walk into the street, honestly, and I still have to be careful, but it's, and that's drawn a lot of compassion from me that, wow, this person learned to cross the street in a different way than I did, because that's not a safe thing to do for them.
Right. Yeah. The crossing the street things, I feel like that's a good conversation that we can take into the cafe after the session. I know we have a couple more minutes to wrap up. So safety is something that came up in the conversation just now. I would just encourage you that when you're thinking about how do I respond and how do I advocate, how am I an ally, sometimes these situations will be like, out in the street or in public transportation, or, so assessing your safety, assessing the safety of the person that you're there to support. I think one way that can be quite effective is to seek to clarify, right? So in the toolkit, right, they have some examples of questions that you might ask to try to get at what's behind, is there an assumption happening here, or is there something else, right? Like, did somebody just, was it that they were tired, multitasking, et cetera, and didn't realize that what they were saying was coming across a certain way, or that they were putting an idea out there that they don't actually believe, right? That might just be that unconscious bias coming through. So you might say, like, I'm wondering why you're asking that question. Is what you're trying to say X, Y, Z, right? And just doing this in this curious, inquiring way allows some benefit of the doubt. It's like, I want to understand what you're telling me before I assume that what you're doing is offensive. So there's this opportunity to engage where they might realize, like, oh gosh, I'm just realizing what that sounded like, right? And let me take a moment to say it differently, because that's not what I want, how I want to represent myself. So, and then, this came up in a few different places, but essentially one way is to pull somebody aside and be like, I don't know if you realize, but you've only been asking the people of color in the office where they're from. And, that can convey that you think that it's not possible for somebody to be American if they're not white. And so, maybe a different way to ask that could be, I'm curious about your heritage, or, my family's from Italy, where's your family from, or whatever that might be, right? So that you can offer opportunities for mutual learning, and essentially to convey, I care about you, so I'm letting you in on this little secret that I've picked up on, is I've noticed you said this, that doesn't really fly, here's a different way to say that, or what's behind that, let's examine that. Is that really, is that really firmly what you believe? Cool, I want to understand that before we can engage. If that's where you stand, that's where you stand. But let's have a conversation or a dialogue then, right? And then as an ally, I think I like this little trick that is basically the opposite of microaggressions, which is microaffirmations. Where are those opportunities if you have particular power and privilege in the workplace, whether that's the status of your role or whether that's based on your social identities, where you can affirm and essentially highlight the work that others are doing, right? One is actually naming, right? One of those tricks in terms of how we encode the contributions would be to name somebody when they shared something so that they get seen for what they're contributing, right? So if I'm like, oh, Sarah had this great comment earlier, so I'm going to build on that. So that's one way that then everybody kind of says, oh yeah, Sarah, she contributes, right? She has great ideas. So crediting people and bringing them into the conversation, right? Oh, I've noticed that, you haven't, you kind of been listening. I'm curious if you have some thoughts. I'd love to, hear what you're thinking, right? So those are ways that you can affirm and bring in people that typically aren't included in the conversation or are marginalized. And then this is something that I borrowed from the UCSF School of Nursing. They have a diversity in action committee, and it's just like another way that kind of breaks down that, like, how do you get at that underlying message? How do you slow things down to make sure that you catch something, especially if you're in a meeting and a lot of conversation is happening simultaneously and thoughts are being shared, and it's really easy to just let something go, especially if like, whoops, that came from the CEO. I'm not going to be the one to call, So how do you kind of slow things down and be like, what just happened here? And can we address it, right? What is that conversation? Oh, you think, all Mexicans are immigrants. Okay, what is that based on? Can we have a dialogue if that's really what you believe? Or is it like, oh, you just didn't slow down enough to realize like that's how that sounded? And then kind of wrapping it up in a learning environment, it could be like, well, this is how this might connect to our work. If we're making this assumption and we're firmly standing in that assumption, what does that mean then for how we're marketing to that group or how we're recruiting from that demographic, et cetera, right? All right, so I realize it's time. So for those of folks that are online, thank you so much for taking the time to engage with us. And feel free to send in some follow-up questions or comments. You will be getting an evaluation, I think, for feedback. And then for folks that are here, we invite you to come upstairs to the cafe. We have refreshments and whatnot and a little table set up that we can continue the conversation. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions that were sent in, but thank you for your time.